Sound check, test prova. Say O. Say O, ses deneme. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Say O, sound check. Var mı Roj? Devam mı? Geçeyim mi diğerlerine?
See, it's 9 o'clock.
Sound check deneme. Noise var mı?
İnce bir hoş var. Ama o şeyde ilk hamle şey yapılmıyor pek belli.
Test. Belli oluyor herhalde ya belki.
Sesin ama ses temiz çıkıyor üstüne.
Ha?
Ses temiz çıkıyor.
Ya onlar herhalde kapalı olduğunda mı şey yapıyor ya delegeler?
Şey mi? Noise'a mı geçiyor?
Açık kaldığında herhalde belki şey oluyor da.
Açayım mı? Bakalım mı öyle bir şey?
Şu sesi ben bir dinleyeyim mi?
Ses deneme, sound check, test prova. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Say O. Say O. Ses deneme, sound check, ses prova. Ses deneme. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sound check. Hepsi kapalı şu an. Sound check, ses deneme. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Pazartesi, salı, çarşamba, perşembe, cuma. Ha 3 şu an. Ses deneme 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 4'e ben sana dediğim hikaye. Şu o 2 yapıyor 2. Ya da o birden de.
Diğeri de istek acaba?
Şu de 4'e mi alsak diyorsun?
Ya şu onların pilli çalışıyor ya onlar.
Pilli mi onlar?
pinch hitting.
Riski açık.
Yeah, I know. And I
Sound check.
appreciate it.
Test prova 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Sound check test prova. Pazartesi. Kapatınca falan gitmiyor mu buradan şeydi?
Did you tell them that this was the wrong room on the transcript?
Okay, they're
Danielle?
on now.
Oh, testing. Can we make sure to tell them about the slide? Don't be confused. This is workshop room 4, and we're talking about transparency reporting, not workshop room 3.
IG literacy.
Not that there's anything wrong with IG literacy. You're just not going to learn about it here. Darn it. There's a bit of a lag. There's about a 5-second lag. Do not watch the live stream because it's a lag. It'll confuse you.
The live stream?
Yes.
Soundcheck. Test prova 1 2 3 4 5. Soundcheck SEO.
All right, I think we're going to get started. Welcome to those in the room here in Istanbul and those watching online. This is Workshop 188, Transparency Reporting as a Tool of Internet Governance at IGF 2014 in Workshop Room 4. I'm Kevin Bankston. I'm the Policy Director of the Open Technology Institute, or OTI. We are a civil society organization that works through an interdisciplinary blend of policy advocacy, technology development, and field engagement to foster a stronger and more open internet to support stronger and more open communities. One issue that we have been researching quite a bit lately at OTI is transparency reporting by internet companies. These reports are a relatively new phenomenon that did not exist 5 years ago. Google was the first to issue a report on the demands for user data and content takedown that it receives in 2010. A handful of companies, including Twitter, issued their own reports in following years, but the practice really exploded after the Snowden revelations of last year. And now several dozen companies, from small to large, from US to international, from internet companies to phone companies, have begun issuing reports. Today, we are going to be talking about the past, present, and future of transparency reporting, both by companies and by governments, how they have or haven't been useful as a tool for accountability in internet governance, and how they may improve in the future. Panelists, who will each introduce themselves and offer their perspective for about 5 minutes apiece, are about to speak. We'll then spend about 15 minutes on a moderated question and discussion directed by me, and then we'll spend the remaining time on questions from both here in the room and those participating remotely. So our first panelist, by virtue of Google being the first to issue a transparency report, will be Google's Mark Crandall, who's going to talk about why and how Google's been issuing a wide variety of transparency reports and the different challenges and rewards of doing so. So, Mark, thank you.
Hi, folks. Mark Crandall. I handle regulatory compliance for Google for Work, which is our enterprise services. And I've been with Google about 8 years. And that's right, we've been doing transparency reports for a number of years now, probably since 2010. And the type of information that we provide in the transparency report has grown steadily over the years. So today, I would say we probably disclose, I'd say broadly, 6 categories of information. We talk about, of course, user data requests, which are requests by government agencies for information about our users, user requests. We also talk about, we also disclose information about government removal requests, which are requests from government agencies to remove content that's publicly available. And remember, this is very different than information about our users. This is information that they'd like to see removed completely. We also, a subset of that, we talk about copyright removal requests, which is another type of removal action, which are requests made by copyright owners and reporting organizations that represent them, asking us to remove material from our search results that allegedly infringe on the copyright or link to allegedly infringing copyright material. So that's the third aspect. The fourth aspect is traffic. We actually show traffic history patterns to our services in different countries, and that's very helpful. That's insightful, because when there's a break in the pattern, the graphs that we provide, they visualize disruptions in that free flow of information. Whether it's a government blockage, it could be a service outage, or even a cut cable. And then another element of information we provide is safe browsing. I don't know how many folks have tried to visit a website linked from our search results and have been provided with some sort of interstitial or warning that the site contains malware or spam. This is called safe browsing. So we provide data about how many users see malware and phishing warnings each week linked from our search results, and how many malware and phishing sites we detect each week, and which networks around the world host malware sites, and then how quickly webmasters clean their sites, or otherwise, unfortunately, would get reinfected by malware. And that's updated weekly. And then finally, another data point we offer is something called Safer Email, which is data about how much email sent between Google and external providers are encrypted email. So all of those data elements we provide as part of the transparency report, and that's an expansion from our earlier reports, which generally contain information about user data requests and takedown requests. So, but that's what we've got now. You're off.
I'm on. Okay.
Go on. Press. Now you're ready.
Can you talk a little bit about why Google is issuing these reports, and perhaps what benefits you have or haven't gotten from these reports?
Well, I just turned myself off. I'm censoring myself. I think that more transparency leads to better internet regulation. And I think this is also this is extremely beneficial information for the users of the internet, because they can see how laws play out on the ground and how they actually affect the providers. So the data allows us to judge whether existing laws are relevant and effective, and if they enhance or otherwise erode these fundamental freedoms. And also, using this data can hold policymakers, and this is also very helpful here in this forum, they can hold policymakers accountable for the laws they enact and how those laws are actually enforced. And so we hope that other technology and telecommunications companies and even governments themselves will start sharing this type of data, because again, this transparency can be beneficial for everyone. You're on.
Well, I mean, I can speak to, just as an advocate myself, trying to lobby the U.S. government to strengthen its privacy laws. The Google reports and now the growing number of reports from other companies has been very helpful in the context of trying to update our Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which is our primary law governing law enforcement access to information, as well as trying to update our national security surveillance laws in the wake of the Snowden revelations. But it's also been useful in terms of changing the behavior of companies. For example, you mentioned the safe email report, which is a very interesting report. I recommend looking at it. That actually shows, based on the servers that communicate with Gmail servers, which email services are actually encrypting their email server links. You know, this is the encryption between email servers as opposed to, say, end-to-end encryption between you and me, or the encryption between you and a website that you're using. And many email providers, including until recently Comcast, did not encrypt this material, and yet after the transparency report was issued by Google and the companies that were not encrypting were named and publicized, you began to see more companies encrypting their data links and thus increasing security overall. So a fun example there. But our next speaker is going to be Susan Morgan from the Global Network Initiative, who's going to talk about GNI's perspective.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So I'll just say a little. Is that better? I'll just say a little bit about GNI first. So we're a multi-stakeholder initiative bringing together companies, human rights groups, investors and academics. And we're focused very much on the issue of what companies can do when they get requests from governments that might impact the freedom of expression and privacy rights of their users. So we've created over a period of about 2 years, going back to 2006, 2007, a set of principles and guidelines based on international human rights standards, really to set out the ways in which companies could respond. So that can be, for example, from making sure that the company is thinking about the free expression and privacy rights of their users from the very start, in terms of product development, in terms of markets that they go into, and also to very sort of practical things in terms of when you get a request, what can you do? How can you narrow the scope of the request? How can you check that it's from an authorized official? So there's some, those are some sort of examples of the types of things that are in our principles and our guidelines. We also have an assessment process for companies that are members of GNI, and we do learning and advocacy work with the about 40 organizations from around the world that are now members of GNI. So that's just by kind of background and introduction to who we are. I'm going to talk about 3 things today. The first is why is transparency reporting important? And it's probably, as Kevin mentioned, it's probably worth noting that transparency reporting is something that's a really kind of new phenomenon. So, as I say, GNI's principles and guidelines were written around 2007, 2008, and don't actually talk about transparency reporting specifically. We talk in our principles and guidelines very much about the importance of communicating with users. And I think that transparency reporting is one of the elements that's developed over the last few years as being a way in which companies can communicate with users. It's only part of the story, clearly, in that it gives very sort of broad, sort of specific data and information, and clearly there's a need for users to be informed when specific issues just relating to them happen. But I think it's an example of the way in which sort of issues around transparency with users have really developed over the last few years. And then in terms of the sort of importance also for wider society. I mean, I think, you know, there's sort of importance of having informed public debate, which is based on sort of facts and knowledge of what's actually happening. The company reports that have come out have played a critical role in terms of highlighting the number of requests in particular jurisdictions. And I think, you know, we've certainly got sort of anecdotal evidence that it's helpful for civil society in particular countries who are trying to advocate for change when there's, you know, additional data out there that wasn't out there before. So that's the first point in terms of why transparency reporting is important. I think the second point is about it's not just about company reporting. There's been an awful lot of focus on company reporting over the last few years, but I think we shouldn't miss the very important part that governments can play in terms of being transparent about their own laws and practices. I think there's three key reasons why governments have a pretty unique role to play. The first is that, you know, they're the ones who can publish the laws, the legal interpretations, and the sort of oversight mechanisms and details about those within their particular countries. The second is that I think they could have potentially a unique role in regards to reporting on the unique number of users affected. We'll probably get into some of the detail around the difficulties of working out how many users are affected later on in the panel. But I think the governments have probably got potentially a unique role there. And then I think finally, you know, they set the parameters within which companies can report. If anyone's seen the Vodafone report from earlier on this year, that did a very good job of explaining in the 29 jurisdictions that it covered, just how difficult it was in a number of countries to work out what they could legally report on. And so that's something that clearly governments have a role to do in terms of making it clear for companies in terms of what they can say and what it isn't possible to say. So I think there's some government reporting on these issues. I think, you know, certainly the UK government in its lawful interception report talks about some of these issues. I think there's some limited reporting on wiretapping in the US. Certainly there's reporting to Parliament in Canada and in the Netherlands. So it's happening to some extent, but I think it's sporadic. But I'd sort of point you towards the recent report from the UN High Commission on privacy in the digital age, which I think is one of the reports that's really started to talk about the importance of transparency from governments. And then just briefly, I'm going to talk about just the sort of emergence of transparency reporting as best practice and GNI's role. So I think the trend has kind of evolved incredibly quickly. I think, you know, Kevin, you've given a few examples of the types of companies that are now reporting, and I think we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves in terms of a lot of the meetings and conversations that I go to. People are talking about there's terrible inconsistency, there's a lot of information we don't still have, and I think actually we should remember that 5 years ago no one was doing this. So we're in a really kind of early part of the stage. There's clearly a lot of work still to do, but we've kind of come a long way in a few years. And in terms of sort of GNI's role and the work that we're focusing on, so we're delighted to have been asked to join the Freedom Online Coalition working group on privacy and transparency. The first meeting is happening today. So we're very much hoping that will be one of the places in the sort of coming months and years where there'll be a constructive and useful conversation about the role of government reporting. You know, we look forward to being part of some of the initiatives that are looking at the sort of consolidation of company reporting as well. So, thanks.
Thank you, Susan. And I just wanted to reiterate what Susan was talking about in terms of the importance of governments in the transparency reporting realm, both in terms of the need for more and better reporting by governments, but also the government's role in determining what companies are allowed to say and what they're allowed to report Post-Snowden, this has been a huge issue in the United States where a pretty unprecedentedly broad coalition of companies and civil society, including Google, including GNI, including international human rights organizations, have been concertedly pressing for the US government to allow companies to publish more information about the national security related requests that they receive, while also pressing for the government to publish more data itself. And we have had some success, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in the meantime, I'd like to introduce Patrick Hazelius from TeliaSonera, which just recently, I believe last week, issued its first transparency report, or 2 weeks ago, perhaps.
2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
Thank you, Kevin. So my name is Patrick Hazelius. I am based in Stockholm, Sweden, working for TeliaSonera, a full-fledged operator in the Nordics, Baltics, and Eurasia. And today I also represent the Industry Dialogue, the initiative by 9 telcos, which launched March last year in an initiative to respect freedom of expression and privacy in the telecommunications sector. TeliaSonera is present in 20 countries, and as Kevin mentioned, we published our transparency report a couple of weeks ago, starting with our home countries, so not as Vodafone covering all our countries, but Finland and Sweden. But we have included a firm company commitment to add additional countries as we go. So our next report will be already in January next year, adding an additional 5 countries. I will speak about mainly three things today. One is the industry dialogue view on transparency reporting. Secondly, some words about my company's own transparency report. And then thirdly, about reporting on what we call major events, so closing down of networks and services, etc. So first, on the industry dialogue view on transparency reporting, and here please note, I cannot speak on behalf of single other companies. That should be noted. So the industry dialogue view, the 9 telcos on transparency reporting, is that first we have included aspects of transparency in our guiding principles, which are available on the net in I believe 7 different languages. And we have committed to report on progress of implementing our principles yearly. We have also committed to report on what we call major events. I mentioned shutdowns of full services or networks, etc. And we have also committed as a group of 9 telcos to compile information on national legislation and regulation that cover this area that we are covering at this workshop today. So what we also do in the industry dialogue is, of course, we listen to each other and we learn from each other. Although actual transparency reporting on figures as such is not part explicitly of our guiding principles. Of course, as this issue has emerged, we have very strong ongoing shared learning within the industry dialogue. And as you know, some months ago, Vodafone published a very broad report. Within the industry dialogue companies, it is so far AT&T, Vodafone, and TeliaSonera who have published reports. And I will say that industry dialogue members will have different levels of transparency reporting in consultation with their respective stakeholders. And in this context, we should also note that the industry dialogue consists of both operators and vendors. And of course, vendors have another approach to these issues. The industry dialogue has a very firm view, reiterating what Susan just mentioned here, that a single operator, a single telco, only has a partial view on the extent of surveillance. It is the primary role of governments to do transparency reporting, but the companies can help in this debate and help with their figures. So some words on TeliaSonera's transparency report, published August 22nd, available on teliasonera.com, of course. The first report contains figures of Sweden and Finland, and also text on major events throughout TeliaSonera Group 20, where we are present in some 20 countries. We will add in January Denmark, Estonia, Nepal, Norway, and Spain. And then the aim is to add other geographies to the extent permitted by local law. So why do we, as a company, provide this transparency report? Well, our priority as a company is to protect the privacy of our customers. But governments in all countries, by law, decided by parliaments, have the right to demand information about our customers. So first we encourage governments to be transparent about these laws and the extent of this surveillance, but we have decided to contribute to such transparency. So in essence, we want to make sure our customers know that the states take access to their data and to what extent. I can go in later maybe during the panel on why it's difficult to compare different countries, because that's often I see what happens as soon as a report is published, such as ours, Sweden and Finland. People start comparing the amount of figures, the amount of requests in Finland and Sweden. That's very difficult, and maybe we can go into that later. So some words on reporting on major events. TeliaSonera and also the industry dialogue in its guiding principles has the aim to be transparent on a major event when it occurs. So when there is a new law in Kazakhstan, or if there is a new law in Turkey or in any other country which has a very large impact on freedom of expression, if possible, we have agreed and committed to be transparent on that. Most often, however, this is not possible. If it's a takedown of a site or of a SMS service or something, national law will state that this is illegal to be transparent about this. So what TeliaSonera has decided to do is to report on a more general level. So within our transparency report, you will find that we write that in our operations, there have been some 10 major requests during the first half of 2014. We write what these requests are about and our point of challenge, what we have done to ask for clarification, where we have tried to be transparent, etc. So we write about it on a more general level. So in that way, we do not put our employees locally at risk, and we don't break the national law. However, we have been also able to be specific in some cases. There was closure of Russian TV in Latvia and Lithuania. And we had, when this occurred, we had news items on teliasonera.com. We have a news item on this new law in Kazakhstan, and we have been very open in Sweden on our point of challenge against the European Data Retention Directive. One more thing, there is another type of transparency which has not been discussed in the context of workshops like this before, and that is that when companies have defined their point of challenge in the industry dialogue, guiding principles, or in own company policies, this of course is then followed up when we meet with government representatives. So TeliaSonera has had face-to-face meetings with ministers and others in Tajikistan, Moldova, Georgia, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan, and explained our view on real-time access for information, SORM, etc., And this we have also published on our homepage, this set of meetings. So we let our customers know to what extent we follow up our commitments in our policies. So I think I'll stop there, and I hope we will get into the difficulties on comparing figures. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, and we definitely will. And I have to say that the flood of telecom companies that have begun issuing reports in the past half year or so has been quite a great development. Prior to Snowden, the only telecom that I'm aware of was a small mobile operator in the U.S. named Credo Mobile that was issuing a report. And now we have Verizon, AT&T, Deutsche Telekom, TeliaSonera, and Vodafone, and maybe some more. I think, as Patrick mentions, and I think as also the Vodafone report makes clear, it's important not only to have good quantitative data about government requests and the like, but having strong qualitative data explaining the state of the law and the types of restrictions on the companies and the difficulties they face is really important. I commend you not only to the TeliaSonera report, but also the Vodafone report, which has a very comprehensive, large legal appendix that tries to attempt to basically describe the legal situation in the countries where Vodafone operates. Not only the laws that govern access to their data, but also the laws that govern what the company can say about access to data. And also another important fact coming out of the Vodafone report that was not just a list of numbers, was Vodafone actually revealing that a number of unspecified countries have direct, unchecked access to its network, something that I think those countries do not want to be revealed, and which Vodafone, I think, was rather brave in admitting. Also, as I think Patrick makes clear, there's been a lot of focus on privacy-related transparency reporting since Snowden, because the Snowden scandal is a surveillance scandal. But transparency reporting around censorship, around blocking, around internet shutdowns are critically important as well, and these are reflected in the TeliaSonera report as major events. Next up, I'd like Wendy Seltzer to perhaps talk a bit more about the kinds of transparency that can help us uncover censorship and content takedown online. Wendy?
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm Wendy Seltzer. I'm on this panel in my capacity as founder of the Chilling Effects Clearinghouse, a project organized out of the Berkman Center at Harvard in collaboration with the Electronic Frontier Foundation and a number of law school clinics. Chilling Effects Clearinghouse is a database of online content removal requests. We started it in 2001, expecting to get mostly individual self-reporting of cease and desist notices, takedown complaints that individuals got for something that they posted online. But we quickly found that lots of these demands were being sent to internet intermediaries, search engines and blog hosts and other sorts of content hosts as those emerged. Twitter didn't exist in 2001, but as we grew as a database, we started to get submissions of takedown demands in bulk from companies who received them and wanted to be able to be transparent about what was and wasn't appearing on their services and why. So Chilling Effects now features submissions from individuals and from companies including Google, Twitter, the Wikimedia Foundation, from GitHub, from a VPN provider and some internet service providers. And through the posting of the legal complaints that they've received, we now have more than 200,000 individual complaints there, showing the demands for removal of more than 100 million URLs, individual pieces of content that are no longer available to search or browse. And that number is growing by leaps and bounds. Year over year, there's an increase by an order of magnitude in the demands for content removal. Some of these based on various aspects of national law. By far the largest number of complaints are those under copyright, invoking the U.S. Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which encourages providers to remove materials or links to materials on a complaint of alleged copyright infringement. Some of those are valid complaints, and the removal of the material is legitimate, and the publishing of the complaint allows researchers to verify that, to see that, in fact, materials that were claimed to be infringing were removed promptly. Others of those complaints are pushing the boundaries of copyright law, or worse, just abusing the copyright law, because it's quite convenient to be able to take down the postings of a competitor by asserting that the language is too similar. Well, of course, competitors who are talking about the same product are going to use similar language. Or to take down criticism. Chilling Effects recently featured the story of a Tumblr called Escher Girls, where a critic of comic book art posted all sorts of fantastic depictions of women in totally improbable appearances to criticize the depiction of women in comic media. One of the artists of some of these comics sent a DMCA complaint alleging that these were his copyrighted material being posted, and Tumblr's first response was to remove the material, because under the U.S. Digital Millennium Copyright Act they get an immunity from liability. They're encouraged to do that, but by posting the complaint that she received, this user was able to draw attention not only to the artist and his depiction of women, but to the misuse of copyright law, because under the U.S. Fair Use law, it's a clear exception to copyright to post images or other copyrighted material for the purpose of criticism. And the best way of criticizing an artist's depiction of women is to show how that artist depicts women. That's just one example of the sorts of things that Chilling Effects includes. We also have complaints under other areas of the law, claims Twitter sends to Chilling Effects the requests for country-based removal of content. Many complaints under Turkish law there in the database. And Twitter, while it is asked to remove the tweets or the tweet streams or Twitter users, is at least able to publish the complaints that it's received to show users why it is that they may not be able to see the material they were looking for. And so that's where I think that this kind of transparency feeds into governance, because we see that the internet experience is shaped by the law and by government enforcement of the law, but also by private enforcement, and also by the private choices of intermediaries acting upon the pressures of both government and private law enforcement. And all of these shape our experiences of the internet, our view of the world through the internet, and our view of the legal and policy environment. So the Chilling Effects Clearinghouse aims to make all of this, all of these kinds of governance more transparent and more visible to the public, to the populace who's affected by these various regulations, and then in turn to introduce means of oversight, because only by seeing the way the laws are being applied and the way the laws are affecting our experience are we as public, as members of a voting public able to express our views both to our governments and to the companies we depend on as intermediaries to express ourselves. And so that public review of what's being removed, why, allows the public to raise news articles, allows journalists to investigate and to bring to light instances like the Escher girls' complaint, instances where copyright holders are overreaching, instances where private individuals may be making demands for removal or that are unjustified. We are currently seeing, for example, the expansion of right to be forgotten across the EU, the right to remove links from search engines that portray you in a light that's maybe out of date and against the way you currently want to be seen on the internet. But if that is applied through intermediaries, if Google and other search engines are told to remove links, how is the public to know whether that's being applied only to remove things that are out of date or irrelevant, or also to remove things that are current but disparaging or dissatisfying to the person about whom they're reported. If a recent criminal tries to remove links to his recent crimes in order to continue perpetrating those frauds, certainly the public would like to remember and not forget that. We're looking into ways that we can help to encourage academic research on the subject without violating the laws and without exposing the private information of people who do under EU law have the right to remove information. So Chilling Effects and its database help to provide this governance, help to provide this public accountability of varying kinds of law enforcement. And it's been used in more than 30 legal and academic articles just in the United States, more in other countries. It's used by journalists, by policymakers, and we're currently in the process of working even harder to internationalize both the team that works on the Chilling Effects Clearinghouse, working through the Berkman Center and its network of centers that reach well outside the United States, to work with legal analysts in other countries, and even potentially to share the responsibility for the database and collection of content. And then we are just at this very moment in the process of transitioning our infrastructure. So the database that we built in 2001 has scaled pretty well throughout the years, but we're upgrading it to make it far more searchable, easier to submit materials, and in turn easier for those who submit and search to use to generate their own slices of transparency reports, so that we can use this data effectively to look at the various places that content may be requested to be removed, and the ways that that affects the broader view of the internet.
Thank you, Wendy. I do recommend that you all visit chillingeffects.org, where actually the Escher girls example that Wendy mentioned is the top story right now. It is really one of our longest standing and most powerful mechanisms for accountability online today. And it's also another good example of how qualitative information about how content takedown works online is very important. But returning to the realm of the quantitative, Ryan Budish is going to talk a bit more about the values and the difficulties of reporting the numbers about government requests for information in particular.
Thank you, Kevin. My name is Ryan Budish, and I'm a fellow at the Berkman Center at Harvard University. And we began to look at this issue of transparency reporting a little over a year ago, when at that point it was still primarily Google and Twitter and a handful of other companies. And the question that at that time that we really wanted to start investigating was we wanted to identify some of the emergent and best practices specifically with regards to requests for user data. And as part of that, we conducted interviews with a bunch of companies, both ones that at that point had already released transparency reports, as well as those that were on the fence about it and were debating it. In order to try to figure out, what were the challenges that they faced, how did they make the decisions that they made, how did they address the challenges that they faced, and figure out their general approaches. And then moving forward, and particularly now as more and more companies have started to release reports, and we've seen what's really an incredible ecosystem, really, of transparency reports. And the reason why I use that word is because there's a great diversity of reporting, which is both great because there's innovation, but it also means that it becomes very difficult to compare across reports. And so one of the questions that we wanted to start thinking about was, could we help develop some best practices or identify the best practices that were coming out in existing reports and offer some kind of framework that might help companies that wanted to start releasing transparency reports do that in an easier way. And then also improve the consistency across reports, both new and existing, in order to increase the value of those reports. So as part of our research, we identified both some benefits of transparency reporting, as well as some of the challenges, particularly when it comes to some of the numerical counting issues that Kevin mentioned. So some of the benefits, and we've talked up here already about the role in policy making and all of that, but when you talk to a lot of these companies, that may be one of the issues that they think about when they decide whether to release a report or not. But it's actually, there's a wide variety of benefits that have either motivated companies in the first place or that they discovered after the fact. And one of perhaps the most interesting of those benefits is that transparency reporting itself has led to better compliance practices at many companies. We talked to one company that before they started doing their transparency report, they were essentially keeping track of government requests for user data in an email inbox in one country, and were using a totally different method in a different country, and there was very little coordination between offices. And it was the fact that they knew that they were going to be putting out a document that was going to have consistent numbers in it, that they really needed to be able to stand behind what that public document was going to say, that motivated them to invest the upfront resources in changing the way that they handled the incoming government requests. And in turn, this actually made responding to requests overall easier and simpler in terms of an efficiency process. So it lowered their overall costs in the long run for handling these requests. But it also made them more consistent worldwide in what they pushed back against and what they did not. And so it generally actually just improved the quality of their compliance. And so that was a sort of surprising finding from our work. Another sort of benefit that companies identified, or motivation for doing this, is that it's actually an opportunity for competition, that many of them see this as a differentiating factor, and I think that's part of what's led to this sort of growth in and in differences in reports, because companies are to some extent trying to one-up each other. And so when you look over a timeline, the initial reports were very sort of bare bones, and now some of the companies that have been doing this for years have, like as Mark was mentioning, their report covers a multitude of things with great detail. And then you see some of the newer companies that are jumping into this, like Vodafone and TeliaSonera, and a lot of these, Verizon's report, Tumblr's first report had a lot of interesting things in there, and so the quality of reporting in general has gone up as companies have been competing on these things. So there's been a lot of interesting benefits beyond just the policy issue that we talked about earlier here. But there's really sort of four big challenges that I think are largely in tension when you start to look at the numbers themselves in the reports. The first is that we want these reports to be useful for events like this, for opportunities for policymaking, and in order to do that, you often need a level of granularity that does not exist in a lot of the reports that we see. For instance, a lot of the reports have been released by US companies, and they have treated the international requests that they have received in very, very different ways. So some do a very good job of breaking down requests by country. Others lump all international requests into one bucket and then do a very nice job describing the US requests that they get. And some ignore international requests overall. So there's just a wide variety of how companies approach the level of granularity, which then in turn makes it more difficult to use it in situations, particularly in international settings like this, where you really want to be able to make a case that isn't just about the United States. The second sort of challenge is that you want transparency reports. If you want more companies to be doing it, it needs to be easy for non-lawyers to create those reports at companies. A lot of companies are not Google and Twitter with legal teams that would rival law firms. A lot of startups, have, one or two at most lawyers, if they have any. And so the people who are going to be creating these reports are often not lawyers, and so this is a little bit in tension with the point that if you want more detail, oftentimes, if you talk to people, they'll say, well, we really want, retrospective versus prospective. We want, warrants, subpoenas, court orders, all of these things broken out. But then you start getting into these legal terminology that a lot of people at companies would say, I don't even understand what this means. And so that's a big challenge for creating reports. Then a third challenge is something that Patrick mentioned, which is how do you make them comparable across both countries and companies? And so The companies one is particularly difficult because companies have very different services, so the requests that they're going to get will be different. A company that has that's largely a public communication service is going to get very different requests from a cell phone carrier that has where they can tap phones or do cell tower dumps or get GPS, whatever. That's very different kinds of requests. The second piece of that is that companies have very different relationships with law enforcement agencies. So some companies, oftentimes they're repeat players with law enforcement agencies, and so they may end up having understandings with law enforcement that law enforcement won't ask for certain things because that company won't, in fact, give them. So their transparency report looks very different because they didn't get requests for things because the law enforcement agency didn't ask for them in the first place. Whereas another company might not have that relationship with law enforcement, and so then they get a lot of those requests, and so it can be very hard to compare without understanding the different relationships that the companies have with law enforcement. And then the final challenge is really that you need transparency reports to be easy for the average person to understand. And this has proven to be quite difficult in part because oftentimes when these reports come out, a journalist looking for a good story picks out the largest number in the report and says, "Oh my God, company X turned over X number of users' data," which is oftentimes not really accurate to the story that the transparency report is trying to tell, but then also just doesn't really help the average person understand what the report is actually saying. So those are some of the challenges that we've seen with the numbers.
Well, speaking of average people, not that anyone in this room is average, but I'm curious, how many of you have actually looked at a transparency report? Okay, good. A self-selecting crew. So how many of you have found them useful in some way or another? Oh, most of you. That's heartening. Okay, great. Well, our next speaker, Juliana, is going to talk a little bit about whether and how transparency reporting has been useful in the Brazilian policy context.
Hi, okay. So I'm Juliana. I'm the Executive Director of ITS, the Institute of Technology and Society. I'm from Brazil. And I would like to make 3 quick points about this issue in Brazil, because otherwise Pranesh won't have any time to speak. So the first one would be the legal context in Brazil. The second one, the lessons we learned from transparency reports. And the third one, final one, the opportunities that we find in transparency reports. So now in Brazil we have the Marco Civil da Internet. I think you've heard of it because we are many Brazilians here really proud of Marco Civil, so we've been talking a lot about that for the past 6 years in IGFs. But it's really interesting because it's, I think, our Internet Bill of Rights, and it took us 6 years to into a complex negotiation with politicians in Brazil, and now it's approved. So I think since the way Marco Civil process was so transparent, because we had many open consultations through the internet, transparency is also a principle in Marco Civil. So among other things, Marco Civil establishes guidelines for the governments, for the Brazilian government in the development of the internet. So we have a paragraph in Marco Civil that says that governments should promote transparency in the internet. So I think it's really interesting because internet and transparency is something somehow connected in our country. We also have in Brazil an access to information law. There's a law that regulates the right of access to public information. It was already in our constitution, but it wasn't regulated before. But now we have this access to information law. But on the other hand, I would say that we have an election law in Brazil. And this law regulates the right, so campaigning in Brazil is confined to a 3-month period. And there are restrictions on how and where political advertising can appear. So this law also specifically protects political candidates from content that would offend their dignity or decorum. So in Brazil, we have elections this year, so things might be complicated. We have a really complex elections this year, so things will affect internet as well. Finally, in Brazil, defamation is a crime, which is prosecuted either as defamation, calumny, or injury. So if we consider these 4 laws, we can see that in Brazil we promote at the same time transparency, but also we limit how information about politics moves around the country, both online and offline mediums. So with this context, what does some of these reports inform us? So for example, Google Transparency Report from 2012 showed that Brazil tops the list of countries that regularly remove digital content. So most requests for content removal was related to political critique. So I think it's pretty serious, our situation in Brazil about this. So plenty of these requests had to do with defamation, which comprised about 2/5 of overall requests. And it's really interesting that at the same year, a regional judge in Brazil has ordered the arrest of Google's president, Fábio Silva, after Google failed to take down YouTube videos related to a politician at Mato Grosso, a Brazilian state. So it became huge in 2012 in Brazil. And it's interesting to notice that we have elections both 2011 and 2012. 2012 was state elections, and 2011 we had presidential elections. So I don't know what's going to happen in our country this year, because we have a really tough election for presidential elections this year. But I can clearly see some opportunities, and I think that these transparency reports can help us. So Marco Civil defines intermediary liabilities. So as Marco Civil defines, the provider is only liable if they fail to fulfill a court order requesting the removal of certain content. So I think if we study better those transparency reports, we can, as researchers, as activists, see how the Marco Civil is being implemented and how courts are understanding the Marco Civil. So I think it's going to be really interesting for us. Also, Snowden's revelations last year were a huge thing in Brazil, because President Dilma, I think you know, President Dilma was really worried about surveillance in Brazil, and spy talk was really popular last year. Everyone was talking about NSA and spies, and it wasn't common in our country. We don't have a well-known intelligence system or spies. No, not that we don't have, I don't know, but that's not a common talk in Brazil. So I think people will worry more about those indicators. They are also important too for policymakers, academics, and researchers, and could help activists more. I don't see people researching that much those transparency reports, but I think there is also an opportunity in there. And as Ryan said, I agree with him, we have to make them easier. We have an opportunity to make them easier and to build narratives around transparency reports, because they can show us really rich indicators about the use of internet and how courts and politicians are seeing internet as well. So that's it.
Great, thank you, Juliana. So reports seem to have been helpful in showing the prevalence of content takedown in Brazil. Content takedown, I expect, will also be a big part of what Pranesh has to say, and then I expect we'll go directly to audience questions in consideration of time, rather than me asking any more questions.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. My name is Pranesh Prakash. I'm a policy director at the Center for Internet and Society, and I'm also an Access to Knowledge Fellow with the Yale Information Society project. CIS is a policy research organization, and it's primarily from that capacity that I'll be talking about transparency reports today. First off, I'd like to commend the Global Network Initiative, which even before the first transparency reports were issued by Google, was pushing quite hard on the issue of transparency, and I think that's great. But as the GNI principles emphasize, it's not just transparency in the form of transparency reporting that's important, but a larger form of transparency in terms of transparency to users and to investors. I'll briefly quote a few instances of where transparency reporting has been of use and not been of use in India, and then go on to a few comments. In India, in response to a question by a member of parliament, the Union Home Minister revealed information about the number of phone taps that were happening. This figure was almost directly contradicted, seemed to be too small when compared with the information revealed by the telecom company Reliance in its filings before the Supreme Court of India in a separate surveillance-related case. We don't know who to believe. There might be a possible explanation for how both are correct. Reliance, for instance, might be taking into consideration requests they get from state-level agencies. The Union Home Minister might have been reporting only about union-level information, etc. But this just goes to show the need for companies to be releasing information of this sort and not just relying on a single government explanation of a particular number or provision of a particular number as the gospel truth on something like phone tapping. Google, their transparency reports have been played up in the media quite a bit. In fact, very interestingly, a couple of years ago, when there was a great deal of agitation about governmental censorship in India, just while that was happening, Google released one of their transparency reports. And as it happened, it contained a large number of requests for government criticism. Now, this... on television, the minister who was responsible for communications and IT was asked about this, and he said on live television that Google was lying, that he had checked with his bureaucrats, and they said they had not sent any requests from their office for takedown of material for governmental criticism or anything that could be called that. Now, as an independent researcher, I can't verify one or the other. Okay, now Google does something great, which is sometimes when they provide the numbers, they also provide instances for flavor. Now, if they actually provided much more of that flavor and greater amounts of detail, that would allow independent researchers like myself to actually say who is correct on this matter. Is Google actually talking about state-related requests which the union minister wasn't even counting? Maybe he's also being truthful about it. Okay, I right now can't tell because neither party is providing me enough information about this matter, and there is no actual way of going and finding out from every single police station in India, okay, and the hundreds of thousands of them, whether or not they've sent requests to Google. Okay, so greater amounts of depth in that kind of information would be really, really useful. Facebook, on the other hand, has revealed information that India has been the country which has, in its most recent report, has requested the greatest number of content removal, except it doesn't tell me what kind of content removal. It doesn't provide any kind of categorization, which would have been really helpful. And the main issue in the Google case was that it was government criticism, which would be, unjustified under the Indian Constitution for removal. One other case I'll just mention. Some small ISPs in India revealed the list of websites that they've been required by the government to block. This has happened only recently, but this practice still has not spread to larger ISPs. And to take Reliance as an example again, which is one of India's largest telecom companies, one of their servers was hacked by the hacker collective Anonymous a while ago, and a list of all the websites that Reliance blocked was released. And this showed that Reliance was blocking websites that other ISPs were not blocking. Reliance was blocking websites that the government had not requested them to block, because I had independently filed a right to information request with the government to find out what all they had asked ISPs to block, and I had gotten a response. And if we have a company, and then Reliance, it seems, actually stopped blocking those websites which they weren't required to block after the Anonymous leak happened. But the day I tried it, as soon as the leak happened, those sites were blocked from Reliance connection. So that leak seems quite genuine to me. This kind of information, unfortunately, might not come out in a transparency report because A, it's not aggregate data, and B, even if companies are providing detailed information, they might not incriminate themselves. They might actually not tell us that they're blocking websites that that are about criticism of their own company that the government hasn't even asked them to block. So there are limitations to transparency reports of that sort, and situations where aggregate reports just won't help, where you need much more detailed information. In terms of user data requests, etc., of course, we can't get into very much detail, but I think in terms of content removal, we must. And this leads me to my last point, which is about the idea of invisible censorship. Traditionally, the largest form of censorship that we've had that's most visible is governmental censorship. And governmental censorship can be fought because you know that it's happening. If due process is being followed, then you see processes happening in court, you see an executive order having been filed, you can, if there's a right to information regime, you can file for information from the government for it, etc. And when things are banned, when a book is banned, there's an official publication about it. You know that Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children can't be imported into the country, you're told. And you can laugh, you can have parodies, you can have counter speech, you can circumvent the censorship. But when you don't even know that censorship is happening, that's much more difficult. And that is the largest domain of censorship nowadays, I would say, where the largest means of communications, all the private platforms that are being operated by, including by some of the companies on this table, actually allow for aren't publishers themselves. There are platforms that allow others to publish, which means they also allow others to request for removal of that content. Yet I actually haven't seen any transparency reports about user-requested content removal, except in a few cases with Google. I must commend Google on this in relation to copyright. And they also send a lot of this information to Chilling Effects Clearinghouse. So, and that leads me to my last point, which is that if a government is instituting a notice and takedown system, or a notice and notice system, or something of that sort, as for instance India has, South Africa has, and these systems are provided the backing of law. So if you receive a notice, then you have a legal obligation, or at least a legal incentive, if you don't want to lose your protection as an intermediary, to remove the content. If a country is actually putting in place something of that sort, they should, at the same time, put in place a government-operated Chilling Effects Clearinghouse. They should be notified immediately, automatically, when a user request is received by a company under that law. And I would like to see a lot more of this. So when governments do that, I'd like to see governments running it. Otherwise, I'd like to see aggregate data from companies about this, so that we know a little bit more about it. Otherwise, this entire large space of what seems to be invisible censorship is just essentially a black hole. Thanks. I'll leave time for questions, I hope.
Thank you, Pranesh. So this is one big gap in current transparency reporting, which is voluntary takedowns by the platforms, and I think greater transparency around that would be helpful. I'd like to move on to questions. Some of the I'd be curious about views on what other features of transparency reporting folks in the audience would be interested in, but we welcome questions of any stripe for the next 15 minutes. First, someone here in the room, then we'll move to a remote participant. I see Rebecca McKinnon has her hand up. And is there a microphone for people in the room, or?
I'll just shout.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Thanks. This is really, I think, useful overview of all the different facets. I wanted to pick up on some of what Pranesh was talking about. And one of the things I've been hearing a lot, talking to different companies and talking to others, is that when a government goes to a company and is perhaps considering making a request, but hasn't yet made the request or hasn't figured out how to make the request, if it's a request pertaining to content that is against the terms of service or against the community guidelines, it's my understanding that a number of companies handle this in a different way than they handle official government takedown requests. They instruct the government, whether it's a national government or local government or whoever, agency, to just use the standard form that any user, any internet user could use to complain about violations of the community guidelines or terms of service. So that these requests aren't then recorded by the company as government requests. They're just going in the queue as kind of internet user reports on terms of service violations. Yet we do know that sometimes governments are encouraged to use this channel. It's not clear to what extent those requests get special attention compared to random internet users. And those requests are not, of course, being reflected in the government requests data for takedowns in transparency reporting. And of course, as Pranesh pointed out, the takedowns that are part of reports on terms of service community guidelines violations are not part of the transparency reporting system. And so I'd love to hear people's perspective, because I've asked companies a little bit, like, why can't you include some of this other private enforcement information in your transparency reports? And they cite a number of difficulties, some of which I'm sympathetic with, like, our spam requests and, anyway, I can see that there's a lot of challenges, but I'd like to hear some perspectives on when it comes to transparency reporting on terms of service violation and community guidelines violation and takedowns as part of private enforcement. What would an ideal approach look like? What should we be asking companies to do on their private, in terms of being more transparent in a useful way that will build more accountability on private enforcement? What are the first steps that need to be taken? What should that look like?
Who wants to briefly?
And I really don't know the answer, so I'm really looking for ideas here.
Please, Patrick.
Okay, thank you. If I may, I'm Charles Mock.
I'm sorry, we were actually going to have a response to the question, and then we're going to have to. We'd like a remote participant to be able to ask. Oh, okay. We don't have any remote participant questions, so we'll go to you next.
Okay.
And then you.
Okay, I'm Charles Mock. I'm actually a legislator in Hong Kong, and what I've been doing for the last couple of years has been that I asked my own government to review their own request for user data and removal request and so on, and they have actually complied with my request for the past 2 years, and detailing at least to the extent of which department has been asking how many numbers of questions and what nature they are on a bulk basis. Now, my question is, number one, whether or not you've tried to do similar things in your country in asking your government or your legislators to help get that kind of information from your government. And second, the interesting thing that I found out is that even though my government has been willing to at least give me some answers, my local internet and telecom companies are not doing the same. And partly I believe maybe there isn't enough user request or user sentiments to ask for that. But I would be interested in knowing, other than talking about the big global companies, Google and Microsoft and so on, what about other more local companies in India and other countries, whether or not they ignore it? Have they been, what kind of incentive are there to drive them to do their own transparency reports? Thank you.
Okay, so if we could first address Rebecca's question briefly and then address that question. I'm very interested in the how do we incentivize more reporting question as well.
Yes, thank you. I mean, my firm position is that there needs to be a clear and distinct separation between entities within the company. So one entity dealing with surveillance requests from authorities and one abuse department which has user requests. But it's an interesting angle, and requests from governments should of course not come into the abuse and should not be handled there. But that needs of course to be checked everywhere and by every company. And to the second question, as Susan and also Kevin chairing here mentioned, transparency reporting is quite new and evolving. So of course best practice is evolving, and the larger companies are leading the way, and of course we would want additional companies to join this work. But a priori it should be governments giving these reports.
Please. And then Susan.
A very quick response to Rebecca. What should first steps look like? Well, the IGF is supposed to be a forum for policy dialogue. There are supposed to be people from governments and companies and civil society, human rights activists, etc., all present here. Here could well be a place where we come upon standardized ways of actually reporting what Rebecca is saying, that people actually take back home, okay, where we develop stuff here, okay, best practices, standardized forms, etc., that Ryan and Kevin, etc., have been working on, and more detailed stuff that Rebecca wants to see, and including your ranking digital rights project. Take it back home and actually do it, right? What else is the use of the IGF otherwise if this doesn't happen? So that would be a good first step, actually having panels like this, and people, whoever is interested, like talking to us, to all of us, like, after we step off here and us actually doing stuff. And should I also address Charles's question?
Please.
Okay, and this kind of goes also to bolster Rebecca's point, which is that in India, section 69, there is one particular section for the government to tell intermediaries to block content. That has very restricted, very small set of reasons for what the government can actually use that. On the other hand, there's the more general provision that the government has recently introduced, which has which anyone can use, not just the government, which anyone can file a complaint under, which is with a much larger list of reasons, much larger list of things that are essentially banned in India, including things like copyright infringement and things that are harmful to children, quote unquote, etc. This, since anyone can use, it doesn't prohibit government officers from using it either. So now, earlier I was actually able to send a right to information request to the government saying, under section 69A, what all requests have you sent? I was able to get a limited, the small list that they had actually sent to different ISPs to block. Now that's impossible because they don't have to identify themselves as government while sending requests under the new provision. And there's no way of me finding out from the ISP, from any other party. ISPs don't respond to any of my requests. Like other companies don't, private companies don't respond to any of my requests. And when I point this out to the government, they basically just say, tell the companies to be more transparent. There's nothing in the law that actually prevents that. Now, so it's not a situation that's easily escapable. And as far as I know, there's no Indian company, no South African company or anything that actually publishes transparency reports. But the incentivization question is difficult, but I'll just kind of say that that it should not be seen as activism that these companies are engaging in, but it should be seen as basic fundamental duties they owe to their customers and their investors that they're actually performing. And I think that change in mindset is something that we should be aiming to get at, rather than trying to get companies to somehow be more activist-y, which most of them are risk averse, they won't. But trying to change the frame of the debate, I think, is necessary.
Susan, and then if we can fit one last question, I believe, and an answer to that, and if there's time, one more. Yes.
Great. So just a couple of thoughts. So Rebecca, to your point, it seems to me that what we want, as a minimum, is accurate reporting and accurate figures. So if different mechanisms are being used, different ways of reporting need to be found. So, I think a conversation around that would be a good first step. In terms of the incentives for companies to report, I think the role of the investors community shouldn't be underplayed. If companies are publicly listed, certainly in the US, there was a very active campaign by a group of investors prior to the AGMs of AT&T and Verizon around transparency reporting after the Snowden revelations. So I think exploring the role that investors can play in encouraging companies to be more transparent is one way of looking at it. I think there's also I think it's also worth looking at, for the larger companies that are already reporting, if they are covering a large number of markets, or if they're active in a number of markets, are there things that they can do in local markets that can help smaller companies or companies who are locally based? Two ideas there.
Great, thank you. Ma'am?
Do you hear me? Yeah, okay. Katerina Filova from Association for Progressive Communication. I just want to build on Pradesh and Rebecca's point about the transparency to users and users reporting, because one of the gaps in this regard is the transparency about reporting and redress for the women who have been victims of the violence against women happening online. And we have done recently study to assess to what extent 3 social networks, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, actually recognize and address violence against women happening on their platform. And one of the major challenges we have been dealing with was actually a lack of the information, starting from the point that you don't have a clue about who is actually working in these companies and who is dealing with this area of work. And there is no available and disaggregated data on the types and number of reports received from users, and also how these reports are dealt with. Who is the staff who is dealing with these reports? What is their training? What is their language skills? Because it's turned to be very critical for women to be even able to report if they were coming from non-English countries. So this is just my point.
And so I'll take that as a statement, not a question, but an important one. And this gentleman with his hand raised, I think, is probably going to have to be our last question, ma'am, right over there. Thank you. We will also be available after the panel if you'd like to say hello. Yes, sir.
Gürkan from Pirate Party. When we listen to the audience and when we check the transparency reports of the last
I'm sorry,
years.
Can you speak a little more directly into the microphone?
Yeah, of course. Gürkan from Pirate Party. So when we listen to the panel and when we check the transparency reports of the last few years, we can see that India, Brazil, and Turkey, the 3 rapidly emerging and rapidly growing countries in G20, have been topping the lists of the transparency reports in the sense that they ask the most number of content removals. My question is that, are these transparency reports actually going to change the government's approach to content removal and censorship? And is raised prosperity going to cause a more moral and ethical approach to free speech?
A very good closing question considering the Turkey angle. Who wants to speak to this one? Please, Pranesh.
I'm sorry to be hogging the mic. No, transparency reports won't change stuff, but they'll provide you the basis to change stuff. Transparency doesn't equal accountability, doesn't equal less censorship or less surveillance, etc. But it provides you the basis to actually make those claims, to see what is justified. India has a population of 1 billion. Of course, it's going to make more requests than a country with less population, with less content online. So we have to keep all that in perspective. And transparency by itself doesn't do anything. It's a tool to be used for accountability, for rule of law to be followed, etc., etc.
And on that inspirational note, thank you. Did Juliana? Did you? Oh, sure, please.
I have something light to add. In our transparency report with regards to takedowns, we also have a small section in our FAQ on fake government requests that we've received, which we've published, including ones from Canada, the United States, Peru. You might want to take a look at that. It's very interesting, the fake requests that we've received.
And on that more lighthearted note, thank you all for taking the time and coming here at 9 in the morning. I know it's not the easiest slot to make it to, but thank you for being engaged and for listening to this excellent panel, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for doing that. Just a little bit. Well, I had to do a lot of work in Brazil with the Brazilian federal police before the separate negotiations between
I heard that the majority of the applications were
an interesting guy. He came to Google, and I went to
and I spoke them today. This is a good change.
Yes, I had lunch with him with all the bodyguards.
Ahmed Qureshi.
Yes, I would have to agree. It was a rather strange
I didn't have a presentation, but I have some written notes, so I wrote up some notes for this panel. So I'll just email you at this. info@efjc.org. I will do something. I will definitely do So how have you been finding the IGF? Yeah, pretty good. Useful for you?
And we were in discussion we didn't want to block the data.
We're still kind of trying to tell our idea to various people. I think we should hear of the UG expressed some interest.
To help resolve this, we did a big training.
We'll figure something out.
I would like to extend an invitation to Mark Crandall.
There's one about internet blocking at 11. That's kind of my next post. We'll try and get a conference on in between. Would love to.
Yes.
There's one evaluating multi-stakeholder for my other part of my work that needs to go
I'm sure we'll catch up later. you at the big tent event tonight?
No, I don't think so. I tried to RSVP and they were like all booked.
Yeah, same happened with me. Same happened with me. I didn't know if it was.
No, I don't know. I don't know whether they'll let me
It's just daunting. Was there are any others? Feel free to let me know.
I heard that he was considering it, but then changed his mind. Oh yes. Strange. Yeah, well, I'm curious. And the other reason I speak a little bit of Portuguese is because about 20 years ago I dated someone from Rio Grande do Sul. Oi, Pichitoco, bem-vindo! I remember. Yeah, that's what she said. Yeah. Yeah. I had a girlfriend in southern Brazil. Yeah. I love Brazil. I love Brazil. And I was in Carnival. I was in the Sambodrome dancing with my Mira. I was in with my costume. Yeah, I'm not very good at samba, but I practice it. Yeah. All right. Really good to meet you. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And I guess I'm sure we'll run into each other again. Nice to meet you.
Actually, I have a question.